This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
And welcome to this week's show. Tonight, we have Jim Harold back again after about a year, and he's going to be telling us some ghost stories, and we're going to be talking about what may lie behind some of these stories. And I think this was a fascinating conversation that happened a few days ago with Jim, and definitely check out Jim's stuff, and if you like these stories, pick up the books, because they're well worth it. Upcoming, I have a lot of interesting stuff coming up, some guests you may not have heard anywhere else before, and we're going to be doing a show at the end of the year, probably the last show of the year, if I can get it all together, of listener stories, kind of like what Jim Harold does with his Campfire stories. Now, I have a few people already who are contributing stories, some listeners. If you out there have a story that you would like to contribute to the last show of this year, a story about the paranormal, the weird, whatever it is, get in touch, contact us on the Facebook page, or my Facebook page. I'm pretty easy to find. Just look for Soraya Azkath. I'm the only one out there. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. You can shoot me an email. If you've already done so and I haven't gotten back to you, I should be getting back to you here in the next week or two. If I don't, feel free to send me a reminder, because I seem to have messages all over the place at this point, and I should have kept them better organized. So, that's what's going on right now, and without any further ado, here's Jim Harold. Well, welcome back to the show, Jim. How you doing?
I am doing well. I'm so glad to be with you again, Soraya. And I really got to say, last time I was on, we got a great reaction. A lot of people said, I'd never heard of Jim Harold before, but I heard you on Soraya's show and thought I'd check it out, enjoy the show. So thank you for that. And it's so good to be with you and your listeners again.
It's been about a year, I think. I had you on last November.
Yes, that's about right. I remember it was right after Halloween.
Yes. So, because, I don't think about doing special shows for Halloween until the last minute.
Well, hey, in our world, every day is Halloween.
True. That's very true. So now you've released a third Campfire Stories, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3.
Yes.
70 more supernatural stories that will freak you out.
Yeah. Campfire 2 was really, did pretty well. It hit number one on the Kindle charts for Amazon for the supernatural category, and I think it's unexplained mysteries. And I thought, well, gee, you got to do a number 3. Probably number 2 was actually, I think, significantly more successful than number 1. So I thought, yeah, we got to keep doing these. So number 3 was a natural progression.
Okay. And where you want to tell people what these are?
Well, if you've not heard of me, I am a podcaster. I do several different podcasts. Probably the ones people have heard of, if they have heard of them, is the Paranormal Podcast, which I've been doing since 2005. And then the show that I introduced in 2009 is called Jim Harold's Campfire. And it's just that we kind of recreate an electronic campfire, and people come on, and just regular people saying, hey, Jim, something weird happened to me, and here it is. So what I do in these books is, from those true stories that people share on the programs, I kind of curate the ones that I think are the best. We lightly edit them to make them flow just a little better without changing any factual information. And then we put out a book. So I think the way it stands now, I kind of calculated out. I've got 2 or 3 books. If I stopped doing the podcast today, I'd have 2 or 3 more books in me. But since we're doing them every week, this could go on and on as long as people keep enjoying them.
And what criteria do you use to determine what stories you're going to put in the book?
I like things that are kind of twisted and weird, something you don't expect. Those are some of my favorites. I do like some of the touching stories. I know there's certainly some scary and some spooky stories out there, but I love the touching stories. And of course, you've got to have some real kind of spooky ooky stories as well. The main criteria is that the storyteller to me seems genuine. I can't vouch. I wasn't there. We were talking about this earlier. I wasn't there when these things happened, but a lot of times I think you can pick up a sense if people are being sincere in what they're saying. And to a person, these were stories where people told these stories and I said, this person had this experience and they believe what happened in the form that they're telling me. They're not making this up. So that's number one. I have to believe, if somebody gives me the best story in the world, but I think it's made up, I would not include them in this book. And then it does have to have some uniqueness to it. And also I'm a sucker for some of those touching stories as well.
Right, and there's quite a bit of diversity in here. It's not just ghost stories.
No, I mean, we kind of started the series with the ghost story moniker, so there is certainly a goodly amount of ghost stories, but there's also shadow people. There are even a couple of UFO stories in there. Everything from doppelgangers to guardian angels and on it goes.
And some near death.
Yeah, and that's one that fascinates me because what I say to people, because I know my friend Micah Hanks, you check out the show so far. We do the Paranormal Report video podcast together, and he's a big UFO guy. And I'm certainly interested in UFOs. But to me, the ultimate question in all of this is what happens after we die, because I hate to say it, but all of us have to pay taxes and all of us are going to die. And it'd be really nice to know what's going to happen, if anything. I personally think something does happen. And I'm always fascinated by these stories.
Yeah. Well, and Micah's been on here dozens of times at this point.
Yeah, he's great. He's great.
The UFO thing sometimes intertwines with the near-death thing, and that makes the whole thing even stranger.
It's funny you say that. I had Whitley Strieber on the Paranormal Podcast maybe 3 months ago or something like that, 2 or 3 months ago, and the thing is that he doesn't say those visitors that came were necessarily aliens. He just calls them the visitors, and I think he considers aliens to be one possibility. And he said that he thought that phenomena may have some tie to what we call death. And what's interesting is that more and more researchers that I talk to, including people like Brad Steiger, a couple of years ago we had this conversation, is that when I started these shows in 2005, I had everything very siloed. UFOs are here, near death is here, ghosts are here, shadow people are here. Cryptozoology, if you consider it part of all this, is over here. They're all siloed, they're all different, they're all disconnected. The more and more that I get into this, it seems possible that all of this stuff is not disconnected at all, but connected in some way and part of some larger phenomena.
Yeah, well, personally, I think that we don't quite understand what reality is.
I agree.
And how we interface with it.
That's right. I mean, to me, it's the parable of the cave, or the allegory of the cave. The idea that we're just kind of chained to a wall and we're watching shadows on the cave, and we're they're coming from a fire, and we're perceiving that as reality, but it's only like kind of this second-handed glimpse. I kind of think that's where we're at. We really just don't get it. What I say, a lot of times the skeptics, and somebody made an excellent point. One of my callers, and I haven't even aired this, but he said he feels there's a big difference between a skeptic and a debunker. A debunker is someone who is seeking a particular outcome. A skeptic is one who may look at things with a close eye and look for evidence, but they're willing to accept different answers.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people who call themselves skeptics nowadays are debunkers. They're right, because a skeptic questions everything. A skeptic doesn't go in with an ideology behind them. Right. They go in looking to see what's there.
Right, and I think that's a very good point. And one of the things that I think comes into that, though, is this idea that people who are interested in the paranormal are out there and woo-woo. Well, the thing is that, we didn't understand DNA in 1900, but that didn't mean it didn't exist. We just couldn't measure it. We didn't have a conception of it, but there was still DNA. And on the flip side of that, scientists used to think that there was such a thing as the ether, and this definitely exists, and we know it doesn't. So who's to say that there isn't some kind of force, this X force that causes all these things or has something to do with all these things that we don't understand? And of course, as you look at things like quantum physics and spooky action at a distance and all of this, when you start getting into that stuff, things get really weird. And the question is that maybe this paranormal stuff does really tie to science. The science just hasn't caught up with it yet.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think, again, I think we need a new definition of reality and the way that our consciousness interacts with it. And when you look at standard science today, they say that consciousness doesn't interact with reality. It's just, we're just a side effect of matter.
Yeah, we're machines.
Yeah, and I think until that sort of ideology is taken out of the picture and we look at it with a more open mind, we're not going to be able to answer these questions, and these subjects are going to remain taboo.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that one thing we have in our favor are programs like yours, programs like mine, and kind of the proliferation via the internet of the exchange of ideas, because, I grew up a big fan of In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. It was really my introduction as like a 6-year-old kid to this whole concept, and or 7 or whatever I was when that show came on in the mid 70s. And but the thing was, at that time there were 2 or 3 outlets. There was Fate magazine, there was In Search of, there were 2 or 3 outlets, and God bless Fate magazine, still going strong. But the point now is that we were talking about this earlier, there are thousands, which is, you got to separate the wheat from the chaff, but there's a lot of different opinions, and there's not a monopoly on the exchange of ideas. And I think that's going to make people more open-minded and give us the opportunity to really expand our minds. I think it's already made a difference.
Yes, I think so too. And I think even the proliferation of some of these reality shows, whether you like them or not, have allowed people to be a little more comfortable in talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you may not think much of Ghost Hunters or some of the ghost hunting shows, but the fact that so many people watch them, and it brings the ideas out a little more into the open, and that other people aren't so hesitant to actually talk about their own experiences.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of it. For example, I'll tell you, people have said to me, I've never told this story to anybody else, but I heard your show, and I felt that other people were sharing, and I felt comfortable sharing it with you and your audience. And then that's not saying anything about me. It's just the fact that it could be anything. It could be any show. It could be, Coast to Coast was doing ghost stories, decades ago with Art Bell with Ghost to Ghost. But it just happens at this time I was interfacing with these people, and they heard other people telling their stories and said, well, I've got a story and I guess I could tell it. Nothing, these people didn't get zapped by a laser beam. They didn't explode. They didn't spontaneously combust. So I feel comfortable. And there used to be a taboo on a lot of this stuff. It would be in hushed tones. I was talking to somebody just this week for an interview that'll probably air, I'm guessing, next year. But a gentleman, we were talking about the beginning of the Ouija board, and it occurred to me that, it was originally a lot of these things. Actually, the planchette was a spiritualist tool before the Ouija board was invented, which I never realized. And fascinating stuff. And, I said, was part of the reason, making it a game made it okay. Because, particularly back in Victorian times, if you would say, oh, I'm going to divine the spirits, people would start casting out demons. But but if you say, oh, I'm going to play a game, well, that makes it a little more acceptable. And it just occurred to me as we were talking, he said, yeah, there's some validity to that. The idea that, you almost had to kind of give it a wink and a nudge, because you couldn't say, I'm really interested in getting in contact with the spirits. No, let's play a game.
Right. And now that the Ouija boards have such a bad reputation, and I don't think there's anything to the boards themselves as much as maybe the intent put into them.
Yeah, it's I think I played with a Ouija board exactly once before doing these podcasts, and nothing horrible happened. But I will say this, I'm very leery of doing it now with all the stories I've heard. Now, maybe that's just ignorance on my part. I've talked to people like Rosemary Ellen Guiley, I believe Linda Dahlman is another person who has done a lot of work with the Ouija board, and they say it's just a tool. But
Yeah.
I'm a little more leery of it, just on a personal note. In other words, I don't think that I would. I think we actually have one. My wife had one when she was a kid, and I think it's still in the house, but I won't get it out and play with it. I'm a scary cat. What can I say?
All right, let's get to one of the stories in the book. I really like the one you opened the book up with.
Yeah, this one is really it's kind of involved, but it's really freaky, and it's kind of like a ghost story on steroids. This was our caller, and this started when she lived in North Carolina in about 2002, and she was going to go visit a friend, a male friend, in Richmond, Virginia, and they were going to meet up for the weekend. So anyway, and her name's Jennifer. And she drove there and she got in, I guess, like 1 o'clock or something on a Friday. And they were going to spend the week together and just have a lot of fun around town and things. And they were talking, and her name's Jennifer. His name was Carl. And said, Carl said, I'm checking on my parents' house this weekend. So, can we just go and get that done? And, you know how you turn the lights on and off. So, undesirables won't think you're out of town or things. So
Right.
he said, do you mind going? And she said, no. So they started to go. And I think it was like a 30 or 40-minute trip. And on the way, became very disturbed. And he said, I remember how I told you this place was haunted. She said, no, I don't. So now that you mention it, yeah, I remember it. He said, well, are you sure you're okay with this? And she kind of laughed and she said, I'm okay with it. And as they got closer and closer, and we go into great detail in the story, he gets extremely anxious to the point when they first pulled up in the driveway, his jaw was tensed, and he said, this is probably the most foolish thing I've ever done. I don't know why I was thinking to bring you here. I'm just going to blow it off. She said, go ahead. Let's get this done. And he didn't want to do it, but she said, go ahead. So they went ahead. Now, it's really, really interesting. They went up to the porch, and he put his key in the lock, and he looked at her with this mix of nervous tension and anxiety. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Now, Jennifer was standing behind Carl when this happened, and to the side. And she said, as Carl pushed the door open, a gust of wind came out of the house. And she said it wasn't a breeze. This was wind, serious wind. It bypassed him and hit her directly in her midsection. She said next thing she knew, she wasn't on the porch, but was standing in the front yard. She had assumed that she had stumbled off the front porch, but it happened so fast she just didn't understand how she got there. Obviously, the wind blew her off the porch. She was doubled over, incredibly nauseous, and had vertigo. Carl came over and said, how are you doing? I'm so sorry. Are you okay? And Jennifer said, no, I'm fine. But she said it occurred to her that she had been acquainted to these ghosts from his parents' home, and they weren't happy. So she straightened herself out. She wanted to kind of stop him from stressing out. So said, let's go get stuff done. So they went into the house, and it goes in great depth in the story here. But weird things started happening. The lights started dimming. She saw what she thought was an entity in the foyer. Then they both got intense vertigo. And they said, okay, we're out of here. So anyway, they go outside, and they got out of the door because they just figured, we got to get out of here. Carl started to pull the front door closed, but it slammed itself shut and locked itself. And she said all of it happened simultaneous. Both locks locked themselves, thunk, thunk, and all the lights in the house turned off by themselves. And Carl had his key in his hand, not even the lock. He tested the door. It was locked, and he said, bleep this, we're gone. They go. Back, and the whole weekend they have like this sense of unease. And the weekend, it's not like this great fun weekend that they envisioned. It was a cloud over the weekend, and they were talking about it and so forth. So they went their separate ways after the weekend. She went back to North Carolina. He was there in Richmond, and over time they lost touch. And the weird thing that happened is when Jennifer moved back to her house, her young son, used to sleep through the night, never gave her any problem. All of a sudden, he's complaining that he can't sleep, because he's afraid of the dark and he's afraid to be in his room by himself. And he says, the voice keeps me up at night. And his mom says, excuse me? He said, there's somebody in the attic. So they kept hearing, or he kept hearing voices after this happened. So anyway, strange things start happening to her. She starts seeing slinky, creeping shadows out of the corner of her eye, even though she never saw them dead on, out of her peripheral vision. Then another day, about 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, she was doing some work at her computer, and she swore somebody broke into the house. She thought somebody had broken into the house and was walking around the house. Turned out that there was absolutely nothing. She lived there about another year. Then she moved to New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she thought she'd left all these strange little things behind. But she said that there were still a few strange things that were going on. And where the story really gets interesting is it's 2004 Halloween, and her son's going trick-or-treating to all these little shops in Old Town Albuquerque. And he's kind of leading the way, and there's this one little bookshop, New Age bookshop. He walks in, they have the light on for the trick-or-treaters. The clerk gives him some candy and looks up and sees the woman and kind of looks at her quizzically and says, would you mind talking to my boss? And Jennifer says, sure, having no idea what this is all about. And this woman comes out from the back, and I can almost picture a beaded curtain. And she says, dear, you may wonder why my associate here asked for me to see you. And she said, it's because he saw the same thing that I saw. You have the most beautiful aura I've ever seen, but you have some kind of entity, something nasty clinging to you. And would you mind if I try to do a kind of cleansing? So she started doing all these incantations and so forth. And Jennifer started to wonder, oh, is this woman looking for money? And the woman must have sensed it, because she said, dear, I don't want you to think I'm looking for money or anything. I would never charge for this. I just want to help you and help you get rid of this. So she goes through the process. And at the end, she says, I think we've helped here, but I'm not convinced whatever this is gone. So anytime you're in the area, please come back, and I'll do everything I can to help rid yourself of this.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, she goes back home. Things seem to subside a little bit. And then she gets back in touch with Carl. And it turns out they're both going to be in Raleigh, North Carolina during the same time. So they decide to meet up, I guess on business travel or something. And so they meet up and they talk. And that day goes back to the day at his parents' house. And he says, the oddest thing is that house was haunted up until that day that we were there. But ever since then, there's been zero activity. And Jennifer makes a joke and says something like, well, whatever it is, I hope that it, and she explained all the things that had happened to her and this woman and all this. He said, whatever it is, I hope it piggybacks back onto you and goes back to Richmond. So anyway, they separate their ways again and go back to their respective homes, her in New Mexico, him in Virginia. And she gets a call from him. And he says, you're not going to believe what happened. She said, what happened? He said that he was going to have lunch with his parents, as he often did. And he had lunch with them and came back home. And as he was getting to his door, the phone started ringing inside the house. And he ran in. It was his mom. And she said, the ghosts, the ones that left those years ago? He said, yeah. She said, they're back. Immediately, weird stuff started happening in the house. So, in fact, that entity had gone cross-country both ways and made a round trip. Pretty wild stuff.
Yeah. And again, when someone tells you this, no matter how incredible it sounds, you never want to assume someone's making something up.
I mean, that, first of all, she had nothing to gain by telling me the story.
Yeah.
And it's very elaborate. I mean, you'd have to take a lot of time and energy to come up with a story like that. My belief is it's true, and it happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the way some of these people present the stories you put in the book, they seem very matter of fact.
Yes.
They're not,
exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. It's not like this. And that's the thing. Sometimes people will say, well, your stories aren't dramatic enough, or your stories. And the thing is that In fact, I had somebody say that. Somebody said my stories weren't something, and I said, well, and she said, I prefer this, this, and this. And I said, if you're looking for fiction, that's great. I just
Right.
I just tell the stories the way that people tell them. And I think that this kind of thing speaks a lot more to what was really going on than, the fictional stuff. And I love fictional stuff too. I love to watch even though I know it was based on some real events, but something like The Exorcist or something like that, that's a lot of fun. But I think there's a time
Right.
for, paranormal reality for lack of a better phrase sometimes.
And we were talking about Ouija boards.
Yes.
And you have a handful of Ouija board stories in here.
Yes.
And the one I really liked was you entitled "It Opened a Portal."
Yeah, this was really weird. And this is another one of those elaborate stories. This is a guy who, this happened when he's 16 years old. And one thing that I really enjoy is when we get people, this is Roberto from Illinois, when people tell these stories, maybe they're 40, 50 years old now, and they come back and tell the story, because to me, it really says this made an impression on somebody. Now, when he was 16, he and his friends loved Ouija boards, all the kind of ghost hunting and paranormal stuff. And one of his friend's cousins had a Ouija board, so they thought they'd borrow it. So, Roberto called his friend and said, "Hey, I know your cousin has that Ouija board. See if we can borrow it. Tell him we're on our way to pick it up." They went over to the friend's house, and as they walked to the back of the house where they usually knocked, they noticed the Ouija board was sitting right there on top of the air conditioning unit. They figured that the friend must have left and just left it out there for him, so they took it. They took it back to Roberto's place. He lived in an old farmhouse with a big property. In the back, they had a little shack, a little hangout that they had. They took this Ouija board there and been using it for about a week, and he said his parents didn't know about it. They were hiding it because their parents were intensely religious and would not appreciate a Ouija board at all. Everybody started playing with it, and as soon as they did, everybody in Roberto's house started experiencing nightmares. His mom, his dad, and his three brothers, all of them were having nightmares except for Roberto. He was the only one sleeping soundly at night. And his cousin, the one that he was playing around with the Ouija board with, spent the night over at Roberto's house, and he had a nightmare too. So all the parents got together and started talking about these nightmares. Roberto's parents and Roberto's uncle. And the uncle said, there's got to be something going on at the house. Have you had a priest over to bless it or something? So the parents brought the local pastor over to get a blessing. But yet these nightmares continued. And all this started when they got the Ouija board. Then Roberto says things started moving on their own. His mom would get up in the middle of the night, and she said she felt like she'd being watched. Sometimes she felt someone touch her shoulder. And then after that happened, he decided, we've got to get rid of the Ouija board. Because their parents found it, and they were really, really upset about it. So they said, we'll take this Ouija board over to my other friend's house, no problem. So they were just going to play a shell game with this Ouija board.
Right.
So they took it over to their friend's house, and they were playing in his basement, and the Ouija board was going out of control, Roberto said. He said that they'd used the planchette so much that the little cotton swab pieces to make it move easily had fallen off. They were missing the little eyepiece, so they're going to give this back to their friend's cousin, and he's going to be pretty upset. He said they put it through hours and hours of use, and it was beaten up. And they asked it, who's the Antichrist? And it said the Pope. So this really freaked out these young teenagers. So probably some kind of trickster entity or something. They were trying to get rid of the boards, but they had what Roberto calls one nice long session where he asked all the questions. Now get this. This is really freaky. He said, show us a true sign that this is real and not just somebody moving it. Roberto said the planchette started moving in a figure eight, and it was moving real fast to the point where they were pressing down on it hard to see if somebody was moving it. They pushed it down so hard that it was literally tearing the board. And it did this for 5 to 10 minutes. One of his friends named David was super scared. He was turning pale, so he went and got a crucifix from another part of the house. And he was watching them play, but he was praying and holding the crucifix to his chest. And then they asked the board to show us a sign that you're really real. And it went to yes. And they asked, what's the sign? And then apparently the planchette pointed at David, the one who was holding the crucifix, They looked at him and he was completely white. They said it was like in the cartoons when characters lose their color. They looked at him and we said, what's wrong? You all right? And they were trying to see if he needed water. They were really concerned that he was sick. And he said, the crucifix. And they looked on the floor and the crucifix was snapped in half. Now, this crucifix apparently was about 2 inches thick. It was big and it was snapped completely in half. David said, I was just holding it and it went through my hands and it snapped when it landed. After that, he said, I don't want the Ouija board. Take it back to your house. I'm done with that thing. So they brought it back to the little shack. I mean, Roberto was serious about this. He wasn't giving up. And his mom kind of saw him fooling around the shack and she asked, I heard you in the shack. What were you doing? And they basically said, what shack? We weren't in any shack. They bought candles and they were going to use it at night and they put the candles in the shack. And they went back to the shack, and when they turned on the door and turned on the lights, they went to pull out the Ouija board, and it was already on the table with the planchette piece. When they went to reach for it, it moved on its own, they said, and they got the chills wondering what had happened. Also, they didn't realize it, but they were walking on wax. All of the candles that they had bought were melted all over the floor. The 5-foot stain is still there, Roberto says. The wicks were just lying there in the middle of the wax. And he said they actually loved it. They said, this thing's awesome. This thing's for real. This is the real deal. And they got more excited than anything rather than afraid. So the parents did realize something was going on, and they finally admitted to having the Ouija board. So the dad of the family said, I'm going to burn it tomorrow when I get home from work. And he usually got home around 4:30 or 5. All day, Roberto was trying to plot a way to get rid of it before it got burned. It wasn't even his. So when the dad got home, he said, where's it at? Where's it at? And he was furious. His parents, Roberto said, it's satanic. You should not be messing with that. You're going to hell. His dad grabbed the board and he was going to take it back where there was a little pile of rocks. So he put it on there. He made a little fire. He was about to throw the Ouija board on there. Magically, it started pouring rain out of nowhere. It was like the Ouija board was spared. And his dad said, tomorrow, as soon as I get back, no escape. I'll pour gasoline on it. I don't care. I'll do what I've got to do. I'm going to burn that thing tomorrow. So the dad came home the next day, and just about as he was ready to burn it, his friend, the one that originally let him borrow it, says, hey, my cousin wants a Ouija board back. He took it. It got saved again. So on the way back to the house, Roberto's friend said that every light post he passed would die out as he passed it. The light would just turn off, and then as soon as he got to the next one, the previous one would turn back on, and the one he would be approaching would turn off. And then his cousin said, when he got there, he said, oh, you guys found the Ouija board. I didn't even know where it was. They were flabbergasted. They said, what? I thought you told him we were going to pick it up. His cousin said, I never even knew where it was. It sealed it for us there. So it almost sounds like the Ouija board took itself out and put itself by that air conditioning unit so they could take it. Now, Roberto still hasn't given up on this all these years later. He says, I've tried to get it back. I've asked this guy to search his attic, his crawl spaces, but no luck. He said, I think it was opening some kind of portal to something in my house, but I'm still curious. I want to know more. I'll tell you, Roberto has a lot more guts than I do.
But first of all, that is exactly how I would react to something like that. Ooh, I want to test it some more. I want to see what else it can do. But especially a kid, that's how a kid is going to, react, I think, to something like that.
Right.
They're not going to think through the implications of it or anything
Right.
like that, which makes it seem like a much more genuine story to me. And not that any of them in here don't seem genuine, but that factor alone is not what you would expect from an adult.
Yeah.
An adult might say, oh my God, let's get rid of this, where a kid is going to be like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying. And that's a lot of these stories, the reactions and the way that they phrase it is very, a master storyteller, couldn't come up with some of these things. They seem very genuine. And I believe Roberto, and I believe if he could find that Ouija board tomorrow, he'd be asking it questions.
And in the case like that, I would think something is using the Ouija board. I don't think it's the Ouija board itself.
Right. I agree.
But something, And Trickster definitely fits that sort of description.
Yeah, that's the thing I worry about. If you were looking, let's say you want to talk to Aunt Millie. Aunt Millie's gone on to her great reward, and you really thought a lot of Aunt Millie, and you want to talk to her. Well, that's very, very good. That's a good thing. But I'm not convinced that whatever it is out there that you're trying to contact, that you say, oh, I'd like to talk to Aunt Millie, but then some other spirit or something latches on and maybe gives you information. Maybe it has some way of knowing some information about Aunt Millie and convinces you somehow that that you are, convinces you that it's Aunt Millie when it's really not.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's what happens a lot of times. You don't know who you're actually talking to because there's no way to be certain.
Yeah, and that's the scary thing to me. You don't really know what you're talking to. I mean, my mom passed away a little over a year and a half ago now already. And if there was a way I could talk to her and I knew I was legitimately talking to her, I would love to do that. And I think many people who have lost loved ones, and pretty much everybody, once you reach a certain age, you've lost loved ones, people, whether friends or family that you care for, and you'd love to say something to or hear something from. I'd love to communicate with that person, but I'm afraid if I try, maybe I latch onto something that knows a lot of facts about her and could convince me. And here I think I'm talking to my mom and I'm talking to somebody else.
Yeah, or it could pick up the information directly from you.
Yeah, exactly. We had an interesting, I won't go into full story, but we had an interesting story in the book where a girl was playing, at that time a girl, she's grown now, was playing with a Ouija board. And she was asking, the Ouija board was, or whatever was communicating through it, was implying that it was, or said that it was her grandmother. And she kind of laughed about it. And it turned out that it wasn't her grandmother. Or it turned out that it might have been her grandmother because she told her information that even she didn't know about her grandmother and found out later was true. Because it's Grandma, how many times have you been married? And it said 3. And she's like, my grandma's not been married 3 times. Well, come to find out, she was talking to her mom later that day. Turns out her grandmother was married 3 times. So that's pretty freaky.
Yeah. And again, I mean, could it have picked the information up somewhere else, or is it really spirit of a grandmother? I mean, maybe some spirits hang around and some don't, and when they don't, other things slip in there where they can.
Yeah, exactly. It is a scary thing, I got to tell you. So I often wonder what we're tapping into when we're tapping into something through Ouija boards.
Yeah. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back in a minute or so with Jim Harold.
Where Did the Road Go can be heard first and usually live on WVBR Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com to ask questions of our live guests through the chat room. Where Did the Road Go is then re-aired on Dark Matter Radio and Deprogrammed Radio. You can download all shows for free on the website, and you can subscribe to us on Stitcher, iTunes, YouTube, or Vimeo. Additional content can be found on our video channels. You will also find our upcoming schedule, book reviews, blogs, free book downloads, links, and more. We are also on Facebook and Twitter, and if you want to help support the show, there are links to donate to us. Everything you need can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com.
All right, and tonight we're talking with Jim Harold, and we're going over some of the stories in his new book, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3, 70 more supernatural stories that will freak you out. And it is an excellent book.
Oh, thank you.
And, you have a great collection here. And I think one of the other ones I really liked was A Night Visitor.
Yeah, A Night Visitor. This gets into a topic that's really one of the spookiest things that, and we were talking about this off the air a little bit. Some of the spookiest stuff are these kind of, shadow person, and you really don't know what you're tapping into. It's like a ghost. You can kind of you can understand it, or you think you understand it. But some of these things that are more, what's the word I'm looking for? Ephemeral, that they're nebulous, are
Yeah.
kind of weird. I'm just trying to vamp here while I while I find what chapter it is, and we will go over it. But yeah, I've got it right here. But anyway, this is particularly spooky. Now, in this story, and let's see, this is Jenna from Oregon. And she said this, she's had a lot of things and dreams and deja vu, but this one takes the cake. She said she was asleep and woke up, and she looked around her room, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving along the edge of her bed. She said, I went to go sit up just to look at it. This thing popped over the foot of my bed near her feet, and she froze. And she said this figure didn't have strong features. It was more of a shadow or a silhouette, and it started slowly on all fours to crawl up her bed. She said she thought she was dreaming, that it wasn't real, and she wasn't yet scared. But then this thing placed a hand, if you could call it that, on her ankle. She felt it. It was real and it had weight to it. Now she started getting frightened. It slowly moved up her entire body, and it finally came up to her chest. She said she was face to face with it. Imagine that, being in bed and have something face to face. And she said she blinked and twitched, and then she turned away from it. And when she came back, it was gone. She sat up in her bed, figuring that maybe it was her cat. She got up and she turned on her light. Not only was her bedroom door closed, her cat wasn't in the room. Now, she said she really wanted to blame her cat. She had a lot of lucid dreams when she was younger. Until this one, though, she'd never had another creature in her room with her. She said this thing actually popped up a few other times later on in the future in dreams, though never actually when she was awake. It was very strange. She was frightened, not because she thought it was going to hurt me, but simply because there was something she couldn't identify crawling on her. I think that's a natural reaction.
Yeah.
When she was about to sit down and think about later, it seemed like it was curious, like it was checking her out. And she says she has an English lit degree, and she's read a lot of folk tales and fairy tales. And she said, you'll find, oddly enough, in these stories that creatures like this can be good or not so good. And she said, I don't know if this was a person, this one was a form of a shadow person, something connected to me. She said it wasn't mean, but it was odd. And that's all she can say. It was very, very strange. That's Jenna from Oregon. And this is one that is particularly weird because, again, Bigfoot, if you see a Bigfoot, you can say, yeah, I can kind of put a shape. I can get that concept. A ghost, right. I can get that concept. Shadow people are, again, more nebulous, kind of, even in some ways, more frightening than black-eyed kids because you don't really know what these are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this thing, it's the fact that she saw it in dreams too.
Yeah,
is very interesting.
Yeah, I often wonder about dreams, and we've done a lot of shows on it, on the subject matter. And I often wonder: is it one of two things? Is it is it a bit of undigested gruel, like Scrooge says in A Christmas Carol? Or is it that we're in a different state of consciousness and that we're just a little bit, that veil between us and whatever the other side is a little thinner? I just think it's, and it's so, I think dreams, I'm sure that science to some extent understands them, but I don't think that they fully understand them. And I think it's a fascinating kind of nether world that we don't really understand.
I think science pretends to understand dreams when it really doesn't know what's going on or why.
Yeah. And I do think science has a tendency to do that.
Yeah, and I think there are definitely dreams that mean absolutely nothing. They're just your mind digesting events or working through stress or whatever. But there are definitely some that seem completely different. Like the Aborigines used to call them big dreams.
Right.
The ones that have actual meaning to them that don't seem connected to your day-to-day events where, you can sometimes meet entities or learn things and some, things like that.
Yeah. I would agree. I think that's actually an excellent way of putting it, because I think that's what sometimes the debunkers tend to do. If some of this is not true, therefore none of this is true.
Yeah.
So, if there's somebody out playing Bigfoot and taking a YouTube video of it, this person's a fake, therefore they're all fake. I think they tend to play that game, and it's one of the more annoying things from the debunkers that we see.
Or the other debunker trick is you see someone who may or may not actually have a genuine psychic gift. And you saw this a lot with James Randi and
Shermer?
Uri Geller.
Yeah, Uri Geller.
And so Uri would do something like, for instance, hold his hand tight with some seeds in it and show how they're germinating.
Right.
Now, whether he was genuinely doing that or not, we don't know. And then Randy would come on and be like, ooh, look, with sleight of hand, I can do the same thing. Well, that didn't prove that's how Uri was doing it. But the implication is if by sleight of hand you can do that, then that must be how it's always done. Which is almost like saying, okay, since I know in that movie that guy wasn't really punched in the face, but it looked like it, then all punches in reality are fake.
Right.
You know, it's like you just kind of cover one thing with another without actually being able to prove anything.
Yeah. I mean, and a famous clip of this, or at least on YouTube, it's famous. I don't know if you've ever seen it, and I don't know if you know this, but it's about a former professor of mine. Bob Jacobs is his name. And he had a very interesting UFO experience in the early 1960s when he was a film officer in the United States Air Force. And just the weirdest coincidence, before, I had an interest in the paranormal, but when I was a broadcasting student, this probably would have been back in 91, I guess, when I was in college back in the Stone Age. But he was my broadcasting professor, and he told my class his experience. So anyway, fast forward to, gosh, what are we talking, 20 years later? And I'm interviewing Robert Hastings, who's done a lot of UFO work on nukes and UFOs and that kind of things, and UFOs over military bases. And he starts to tell his story about this young film officer who saw a missile exploded in front of his, or on film, of this missile test that he was in charge of filming. And I didn't say anything during the interview because I didn't want to spoil the interview. And we got off the interview and I said, are you talking about Dr. Bob Jacobs? He's like, that's exactly who I'm talking about. And I'm like, what a small world this is. So then I do some more research. Turns out that Dr. Jacobs was on Larry King, which, love him or hate him, Larry King did a lot on this kind of stuff. I always thought, I gave him a lot of credit for that. And he had, Bob Jacobs was on with Robert Salas, who was an experiencer at the Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana, I believe in 67, something like that. And Stanton Friedman might have been on there, and Bill Nye, the quote science guy.
Right.
And Bill Nye started just throwing out these generalities, not specifically about any of the cases, but throwing out vague generalities, basically saying, well, these guys are just, they're just mistaken, blah, blah, blah. And Dr. Jacobs took him apart on national television. He's like, listen here, pal. I was there. I'm paraphrasing. I was there, so don't tell me what I saw. And that was great. And if anybody ever wants to see that, look up Bob Jacobs, just like it sounds, and Bill Nye on YouTube, and you will see a debunker, basically just totally taken apart intellectually. And I thought it was great because the thing is that Dr. Jacobs and these other gentlemen on the panel I've interviewed, I think all of them. Hastings was on there, Salas was on there, Stanton Friedman might have been on there, and Bill Nye, the science guy. So I've talked to everybody on the panel except for Bill Nye, the science guy. And I like all the people I talked to, but Dr. Jacobs I knew. Stand-up guy, good academic, great teacher, fantastic teacher, real-world teacher, told you the way it was. And had been a university professor, PhD for 40 years or longer, and plus had all this real world broadcast experience. Just a great guy. I could just talk about him for hours. And I know this guy's credible, and he has nothing to win, no money or anything to win by telling the stories. He's told the same story because I heard the story 20 years ago and it hasn't changed a bit. So to me, somebody like that to just say, oh, you must be imagining. Well, part of the story was basically, and I may be getting the exact details, but essentially, basically they confiscated the film, and like two plainclothes guys come in and said, you're never to speak of this again. Well, if it was nothing, if it was, the planet Saturn or one of the swamp gas or whatever Bill Nye was saying, would they've gone to the trouble? So to me, either it happened or it didn't. Either Dr. Jacobs is telling the truth or he isn't. And a lot of times debunkers will throw this stuff around and just say, well, it can't be that, blah, blah, blah. But this was a case, not only was the sighting, Dr. Jacobs was saying all these other things that happened as a reaction of what was seen on the film. He was told by superiors, you're not to speak of this. Also, either that happened or it didn't. If it was swamp gas, I don't think that the authorities would have reacted in that way. So right there, that tells you something very unusual happened.
And the thing is, when I look at all this different phenomena out there, whatever it turns out to be, these people are seeing something. When people see a UFO, if they can't identify it and it's flying along, that's a UFO. It doesn't mean they're extraterrestrial. It could mean they're extraterrestrial, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't prove anything. But when you have these cases, these people are genuinely seeing something. They're genuinely unexplained. You can't just dismiss them because they don't fit into your worldview.
Exactly.
The same with Bigfoot. People see these things. Now, whatever they end up turning out to be, whether it's a trick of the mind, some kind of actual animal, some kind of interdimensional paranormal explanation, whatever they end up being, there's actually something there that people are seeing, because there's simply too many accounts over time that they're not being made up. Some of them, sure, some of them are fake stories, they're being made up, but there's just too many, they're too consistent. There's got to be some truth behind it, no matter what that truth turns out to be in the long run. And
95% of them could be people who are mistaken. And as I often say, even if, let's say, of all the people who have supposed paranormal experiences, and I kind of throw cryptozoology in here as well, and let's say that 2% are actually seeing, and I had this discussion with Shermer, who was on my show, and I give him credit for coming on my show, Michael Shermer. And I said, okay, Dr. Shermer, let's say that you and I agree about most cases that they're explicable, because we probably actually do, or many cases at least. And I said, we probably agree a lot of the time, but aren't you willing to admit that there's a small percentage where, all the rational explanations have been looked at? Person's credible. There's just something doesn't seem to add up. And he said, oh, yeah, we recognize that. And we put those on a shelf. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Put them on a shelf. Take them down off the shelf. Dust them off. Examine those. Let's look at those cases. Because all it takes is one.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So you have a story in here that's a little bit touching. It's called A Little Guardian Angel.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a sucker for the kind of the touching stories, because I really do believe, to me, I was just saying this last night to someone, I believe that, like most things in life, the paranormal is a continuum. And you have those scary things that happen, like some of the ones that we talked about earlier, the Ouija board and a weird entity. Yeah, and then you have some sweeter things, just like life. You have hardcore criminals, and you've got puppies, And I believe that this, I believe this kind of thing happens. And this is actually a very interesting story. This happened, now, this is probably a couple of years ago, so the dates are a little different now. But this was at the time of the telling. This was about 15 years ago. And our caller had just gotten married, and his wife and he had had a great first year. But then she started to get very sick, and worse, to the point where she spent the next 2 years in and out of hospitals. And he said when they got married, they did it for sickness or health. So they took the vows seriously. And she had a very serious surgery, and the doctor said, okay, we're done, and we've done all we can do here. So we're going to put her on life support, and she can come home, and you can take care of her. And that's what the man did. He took care of her. And he said it was very difficult, more than he could have imagined. But he says you get through it, and you become a better person for it, he says, and I would agree. And he said they definitely became a stronger couple. They've been in their house for about a year and a half, and his wife was asleep most of the time recovering. One day when he was in the kitchen doing dishes, out of nowhere he saw a little boy in the house, in the hallway. He didn't know who it was and why he was there. He looked like any 8-year-old boy, a little toe-headed kid, and it looked like he was wearing a T-shirt and long pants. Looked like any other boy in the neighborhood. He saw this boy run into his wife's room, and he went in there and looked for him, like, who's this kid? And nobody was there but the sleeping wife. Then he opened to look out the front door, thinking the boy had run out. Nobody there. He thought about it and figured it was stress. His blood pressure was through the roof. And he said, I'll keep this to myself. About a month later, he saw the little boy again. He went right through the hallway until the wife's room. And again, nobody was there but his sleeping wife. He wanted to tell her about it, but thought, oh, she's going through so much. I don't want her to think that I'm losing my mind because she's depending on it. So he didn't tell anyone else. He didn't want anybody else to think he can't handle what's going on. So he kept this to himself for a year. He kept seeing the boy in the house consistently going into their room. And every time he walked in to follow the boy, there was nothing there. He said there was even one instance where he heard his feet patter across the hallway. The whole time his wife was recovering, he assumed that she didn't know anything about this boy. So one day, after she got better, she turned to him and said, to her husband, she said, when you were gone, a lot of the times I was alone in this house, I always felt comfortable by that boy who would come in and sit with me. And he said it just blew his mind. And he looked at her and he said, a boy? What kind of boy was in the house? It was just me and you. And she said, no, there was a boy. He was about 8 or 9 years old, and he would come in and sit there, and sometimes he'd stand there. And I always felt comforted by him. At the time, she thought he was an angel. She said, there's nothing I could do. I couldn't talk to him, but I just saw him there and I felt comfortable. Turns out the boy never spoke to anybody. Our caller would see him in glimpses, see him in the hallway going to the bedroom. She would see him come in the room and stay there with her. She'd wake up, she'd see him, get a good feeling, go back to sleep. And turns out she saw him way more than he did. Huh. Every time he saw him, he said there was a feeling of comfort. It was benign, but it did make him curious. Now, he said that he and his wife were not angel people per se. It wasn't something that they were into. Right. But they're grateful for the experience. It's nice somebody was with her when he wasn't around. The wife recovered and the boy started coming. Now, he says there's a little coda to the story. He thought that the boy was gone, but after the wife recovered, didn't see him again for several years. Then his wife was stricken with cervical cancer and she was undergoing treatment. And guess who? Second day back from the hospital, little boy shows up. Our caller didn't see him as earlier. He just saw him as like a weird light anomaly that would just flit through the house and go right back into the bedroom. He said, I would naturally again run in the room. There was no one there, and I would tell her I saw some light. And she said, yeah, that's a boy. I've been seeing it again. And she saw him for about a period of 2 more weeks until she had finished her treatment, and he was gone again. It seems like he's attracted to her in the time of need. And at the time of this storytelling, his wife again faced another health crisis, and the boy is back. Now, one thought that they had, that the family had on it, was the mother of the wife was pregnant 2 other times and had a late-term miscarriage. And the prevailing theory is that maybe it's one of the brothers that she never got to meet in this life coming here to watch over her when she needs help. And that was Hunter from New York.
And he's written a fictional book about this too.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of drew on that experience. In fact, let me just see here. I just want to give you the title of that. Let me just pull that back up. The title is The Waiting, and Hunter Shea. I'm assuming you wouldn't mind me using it because it's in the book, and also he's selling a book. Hunter Shea, S-H-E-A, so you can check that out. But very heartfelt stuff. And I believe that happens. I believe there's just strange things happen, and the universe can comfort us in many different ways.
Sure. And I also, I mean, that's a totally reasonable explanation that it could be a brother who was never fully born. I also wonder if our minds can create these things when we need them. Externalize something.
There's actually a book about that. And Ian Punnett, the former excellent host of Coast to Coast, had a guest about this, about people who have been in, I've got to find what that book is because I'd love to have the guy on as well. That people like, I think it's called the third man syndrome or something like that. People being in kind of these tenuous situations and suddenly somebody appears. Yeah, third man syndrome is what it's called. The third man factor. And this is from Wikipedia, so it's got to be true. The third man factor, or third man syndrome, refers to reported situations where an unseen presence, such as a spirit, provides comfort or support during traumatic experiences. Sir Ernest Shackleton, according to Wikipedia, In his book, South, described his belief that an incorporeal being joined him and two others during the final leg of their journey. And it doesn't say where the journey is, but I think it was on mountain climbers. And there's also another book by John G. Geiger called The Third Man Factor. So I'd forgotten about that, but you saying that just remind me of it.
Because, I mean, again, when we talk about how consciousness interacts with reality, we may unconsciously create these things so that they're there to help us or give us comfort or whatever, because we can't access what we need directly within ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And very much to this point, I'm going to put this on the list for a guest next year.
I enjoyed the doppelganger delivery one.
Yeah. Oh, that is a weird one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I've had, even since then, I've had more doppelganger stories. And that's one of the more strange ones, especially when you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's experienced this, because, you're walking around, you're minding your business, and then somebody reports to you a doppelganger. That is just, that's just a real weird one. So this was a young woman who was in high school in the 90s, Amanda from Indiana. And this was the late 90s. And one day she was sitting in class when the office assistants came into her room and had 3 Oxford white shirts for her. And she recognized them as her shirts, but she couldn't figure out why they were brought in for her. She thought that her mom had just lost it, and for some reason, she didn't know, thought that she needed them. She was really confused by why these shirts were sent to her. She didn't call for them or anything. So at lunch, she called her mom, and she said, "Why did you send these shirts to school? I don't need these." And she had no idea what I was talking about. She was on the other line with my dad. That's what Amanda says. And she clicked back over and said, "Your dad said that you called him and said that you needed them." There was only one problem. Amanda had never done any such thing. She said she's a little OCD sometimes. In the day or two before, she just rearranged her closet and reorganized it. She doesn't have any brothers or sisters, and nobody but her parents have been in her room. And she said to her mom, "Hang up, I'm going to call Dad." She called her dad, told him he'd never called or asked for any shirts. He said, "Yes, you did. You called me and you told me exactly what shirts you needed, exactly how many there were, exactly how many there were in your closet, and you told me where I needed to take them at school. You said you needed them." And Amanda said, "I never called you." Now, she thought it might be natural to consider it was a prank, but that doesn't make sense either. Now, this happened in the middle of the school day, and she said back then, a lot of people had, the rudimentary cell phones before apps and games and things. But
Right.
the fact is that at that point, since you couldn't do anything with them other than make calls, people didn't carry them with them throughout the day. They just left them in their lockers. Now, it turned out that her dad owned his own business, and the call was made to his business line. And the only people who might have even thought to do this would have been her closest friends, and her dad knew them very well, so he would have recognized their voices. And she believes that she would have a hard time believing that anybody, especially your friends, would have done that to somebody who was in the middle of their workday. And it really wasn't funny. There was nothing,
Right.
It wasn't like a gag. It wasn't like putting 100 pink flamingos on somebody's lawn. There was no punchline to it. It just would be completely random. So she says, "I don't know what happened." She said, "Some people I've talked to says it sounds like poltergeist activity. I don't really know." She said, "Was it a doppelganger calling out for laundry?" The thing is, I just had one on my show that was, and I told this at a local event I was speaking at. And this isn't in any of the books because it's only maybe a month old. And this woman was really worried about her brother, and because he had lost his job and he was kind of depressed. They were adults, lived in different cities. And she lived in Columbus, Ohio, this woman. And her brother was from out of town. And her sister used to live in Columbus, but was now living, I think, in Chicago at this time. So anyway, she's very worried about her brother. And this particular day, she's kind of tooling around town, and people keep saying, "Hey, I just saw your sister. I just saw your sister." And she's like, "That's weird. My sister's not in town. She's in Chicago." So anyway, this woman goes home, and she doesn't have the contact information for her brother. So she was going to call her parents and get it because I guess he had moved or something. So anyway, right in the middle of her bed is her sister's business card with the brother's name wrote out in it on the sister's writing. Okay. And she thinks she must be in town. So she calls Chicago, her number in Chicago, and says, or I don't know if it was a cell phone, might be a cell phone. She said, "Are you in Columbus?" She said, "No, I'm in Chicago." And she's like, "Well, people have neighbors who know you have reported you being in town, and I have your business card with your writing with our brothers right in the middle of my bed." No explanation. Nobody knows how. Nobody knows why. That was the correct contact info. She got in touch with her brother, but it's just strange.
Yeah.
Strange phenomena.
I had a doppelganger experience only once in my life when I was in junior high, I think it was. And I had come into school very late. And I have always stood out a little bit because I'm a bigger guy and I have long hair and I would wear, I think at the time, a denim jacket. And I didn't look like everyone else in school. I wasn't going to be mistaken for anyone else in the school. And I went into the office or whatever I needed to go into because I was late.
Right.
And they just kind of looked at me weird. And they're like, "What are you here for?" And I'm like, "I'm late." And they're like, "We saw you earlier." And I was like, "No, I just got," and both of them were absolutely certain they had seen me walking up and down the hallway repeatedly prior to me getting to school. And I was like, that didn't happen. I wasn't here. And I'm going, "You can call my house and talk to my parents. I was home."
Yeah, I've heard stories like that, exactly like that. And it is just bizarre.
And you get it too with the UFO phenomena. John Keel talked a lot about like a woman calling him. I think it was in the Mothman prophecies, calling him and saying, "Are you at the end of my road?" Because she saw him kind of standing out there being a little bit weird, and she got freaked out, went inside and called him, and he was at home in New York City.
Right.
So what really is going on with these cases?
Yeah, and that's gets to your point earlier that reality, I think, is far stranger. Maybe it's a multiverse. Maybe we're crossing over these. Maybe it's like a record for those of us who remember those. And maybe it's like, we're one track over,
Yeah, or maybe it's a trickster phenomena as
yeah,
well.
That's true. That's true.
You're on WVBR FM Ithaca. We have a couple more stories here from Jim before we get done. And let's get to these. I think I had 3 more picked out that I really liked. The headless conductor's lamp.
Oh, yeah, this is a freaky one. Basically, this is, I believe, down in Arkansas. And our caller was traveling, and this was like in the early 70s, I believe, was traveling with her mom down this highway, this deserted highway, and a bunch of teenage girls. And it was supposed to be, the kind of legend in the area had it that there was this headless conductor who would walk around with a lamp because he'd been decapitated in the line of duty, and he had the lamp supposedly looking for his head. And she had been out there quite a few times, never saw anything. And this one particular time they were out there, and this light started following their car. And they were going like 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. And this light kept following the car. And as they would go along, it would dart from one side of the car and have one side of the, imagine teenage girls screaming. And then it would go to the other side. And finally, the mom got kind of sick of it and said, "We're going to stop the car and we're going to see what this is." And she went out, and it's like floating above them. And then they go away, and then it continues to follow them. And the thing that was interesting is they could not shake it. And I think she said it was something like the shape of a basketball. And she said, this is the early 70s, so there weren't any drones.
Right. Huh.
And the thing is, what was interesting to me is that her mom, swore to her dying day that this happened. Her mom was very religious. This was totally against her worldview. She didn't believe in anything paranormal and anything like that. But it just kept, it kept following and following and following them. And who knows, maybe it was that headless conductor. But the thing is that, again, a real story. And another thing that appeals to me about that story, it happened 40 years ago, and a person still feels compelled to tell it. That means to me it really happened.
And really imprinted on them.
Absolutely. And I hear that a lot. It's one of those things where people really, they get into it. And they could tell you a story and it can really impact them so much. You can hear a quiver in their voice. Some people say, I'm telling you this happened 30 years ago. I've got a chill up my spine, all of this stuff. So it's really pretty remarkable.
All right. And again, there's so many possible explanations. I mean, I think a lot of people would jump to UFO, and technically it was an unidentified flying object.
Yeah.
But it reminds me more of like the Marfa lights.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Spook lights, things like that. Definitely. And again, it's so difficult. I mean, how do we find answers to these questions? Because it's not something that you can, well, I know some of these things do recreate, but you can't, it's hard to test against it. You can't put it in a test tube. You can't put it on a scale. It's much more like botany or something that you're studying in the field. I had one gentleman, I think it was Lawrence LaShawn, on, who talked about that, the act that this is something you study while it's going on. It's not something that you can recreate in the lab.
Well, even the Marfa lights, I mean, they appear pretty regularly, but they're not really anything we can actively study, because if you go near them, they take off, but then they'll follow you.
Yeah.
They act like they have intelligence, whether they do or they're just reacting to something we're not aware of.
Yeah, and this was definitely the case with this light, because it bounced from side to side. It stopped when she stopped. And apparently, the woman apparently had a really hard time reconciling it. Years on, I guess our caller talked to her dad about it and said, yeah, she talked about it, but she didn't like to talk about it because it just flew in the face of everything she believed.
All right, let's move on to the Phantom car.
Yes. This is another one that's kind of like John Keel-like, I would say.
Yes.
It's kind of one of the really just strange. Happened in 1980. Our caller was 10 years old, and he grew up in southeast Maryland. And he said there were about a dozen houses in our neighborhood, and ours was the last one on a dead-end street. And he said this happened on a Friday or Saturday. His parents were out on a date, and he was home with a babysitter. And he was in his room looking out his bedroom window, and he's waiting for his parents to return. There was a gravel road out in front of their house, so you could hear cars when they were coming up the road. And anybody who's been in a house like that sounds like my grandparents' house. You could hear somebody coming up the alley with that like snap, crackle, pop of the stones. So anyway, he was looking out the window, and he heard that noise. Figured it was his parents. He looked out. He saw the silhouette of a long black car. He can only describe it as maybe a Lincoln or a Cadillac. Late 1960s model, that kind of black car. He said the headlights weren't on, so it was just kind of cruising along. He saw a silhouette of it. As he got closer to the front of the house, the interior light of the car came on. The interior of the car was illuminated. You could see the driver. It appeared to be an older man wearing a hat. His eyes were very dark and recessed, but he couldn't really make out the face too well. Just as he saw him, the man turned and looked towards the boy's house. He said he was in his rooms with the lights out, so he didn't feel that this man could see him directly, but he felt like he was looking at his house. There were 8 to 10 mature trees out in the front yard, oak trees, and as the car drove past these trees, one in particular, it just disappeared and did not reappear on the other side. He said the best he can explain is it drove behind one side of a tree and simply disappeared. He said, like I said, we were on the end of a dead-end street, so there were 3 posts there with reflector lights. There was no cul-de-sac. There was no reflection off of the reflector lights. This wasn't where somebody could turn around easily. He would have had to turn into the driveway or into the neighbor's driveway and then turn around to get out. Not the sort of thing he would have missed. Nothing like that happened at all. It was gone. Very strange. He said he kind of freaked out. He remembered telling his parents and his brother, but they didn't give much stock to a 10-year-old kid. He said it's 30 years ago, to my point early, this is Chad from Maryland, and I can still close my eyes and see that car disappearing. It's pretty creepy. He says, I'm a fan of the paranormal, but I don't go ghost hunting. I did see a strange orb out that same window once, but the time with the car was the only instance where something, truly along that line, that remarkable happened. He said It didn't know where it vanished to. It didn't make sense.
Huh. And it does sound like something John Keel would have reported.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely
does. These last few you put under a category that just says bizarre.
Yeah.
So just that one before it.
Yeah, it was one of those. It was kind of like something that's inexplicable, It's just kind of, you can't really categorize it. It's just weird.
And the last one I had picked out was a big blue circle.
Yeah, and this is one of my regular callers who calls us all the time, and you kind of get to learn some listeners. And this guy, to me, just reeks of credibility. Just a real sincere guy, and he tells this story. This is Tom from Illinois. He says his family was driving up north from Illinois to visit his in-laws in Wisconsin, about 5 or 6 hour trip. He likes to drive at night. So it was probably 8:30 or 9 p.m. There was a very overcast sky and the clouds were hanging really low. He said it wasn't storming or raining or no lightning or thunder, just overcast. He said they were driving along and he swore he saw a blue, almost baby blue light shoot just really quickly from left to right across the sky. He turned to his wife and he said, "Did you see that too?" She said, "That streak of light that just went by?" She said, "Yeah." So they thought that was kind of weird. They drove a bit longer. All of a sudden, the whole horizon lights up with a quick blue flash of the same color blue. They thought it was lightning. But again, there were no storms in the area. Then a half hour had passed and there were no other flashers. That's all they could talk about, though. They kept wondering. So they drove along for a while and then they saw almost a perfect circle in this cloud of that same color blue. It was just lighting up one spot in the cloud. They were looking around because they thought it might be a spotlight. It wasn't because they had seen that beam of light coming from the ground, especially at night. This spot wasn't moving at all. So it was just there. It wasn't like a time thing. There wasn't a pattern like you'll see Klieg lights kind of go in a figure 8 or whatever. He said they would just arbitrarily dim and then brighten. He said we were driving toward, and he said, "We're going to go under this thing." And they were looking for any kind of explanation. And he said, it's the middle of Wisconsin, so there's nothing out there. Sure enough, they drove right under it, and it was almost a perfect circle. It was just blue. He drove under it, and that's all they saw for the rest of the trip. He said it was an eerie feeling. He said it very well could have been some sort of weather phenomenon. He doesn't really know. All he can say is he's never seen any weather like that before. And he drives up north all the time, and he's been going up there since he was a kid. He says he doesn't know what weather phenomenon would cause just a one little circular part of a cloud to glow blue. It just gave him a really eerie feeling after he drove under it. He said he was actually kidding with his wife nervously, and I said, "Do we have any missing time?" He said, "What time is it?" He said, and I love this, he said, "Jim Harold's never going to believe this." He said, "I knew I was going to call you right away." He said, "I never saw any news reports or anything like that following this, and there were other cars on the road. They had to have seen it. I mean, the whole horizon practically lit up when it flashed. Then other cars were driving into this thing. If any readers know exactly what it is, if it's some kind of weird weather phenomenon, I would love to know because it still kind of freaks me out." He said that's his first one, his first UFO sighting, and a wild one it was.
And it definitely counts as a UFO. I don't think you're going to get an explanation of it being a drone or experimental aircraft in that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't really know what it could possibly be, to be quite honest with you. So
yeah, it's really weird.
It is very weird, in fact. And I got to say, the thing is that that's the case with a lot of these. You just can't put your finger on it. It defies explanation. And frankly, I think that's what makes it so fascinating to me, is this idea that there's these things out there. We're so smart with our smartphones and our, all the things that we have. And still there's this huge category of experiences that we don't understand. And that to me is amazing. And I don't really know, I'm in my mid-40s. I don't really know that I'll ever have the answers, but it's sure a lot of fun to explore the questions.
Absolutely.
So.
Now, let me ask you this: have you ever had any of your own experiences like this?
A couple of things. I had an instance where, like a premonition, where I was walking with a young lady. I must have been about 18 or something, and we were walking past a log truck. And I was on vacation. It was in a rural area, and we were walking and talking. Walked by the truck, and said, maybe I should get out of the way here. Don't know why, and decided to get out of the way quickly. Walked about 10 feet, and every log on the thing fell off on the same side I was walking.
Oh, wow.
So, it just, it's one of those things where you kind of wonder. You just kind of wonder.
Yeah. Interesting. All right, so the new book
Yes.
is True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3, 70 more supernatural stories that will freak you out. And although I picked out some of the ones I like the most, there's not a bad story in this book.
Oh, thank you. That's
They're all very good.
very kind of you to say, and I really, appreciate the opportunity to come on and share some stories and talk to your listeners and talk to you. And I think we all share this love of all things spooky. If people want to check out the book, an easy way to find it, I just did a simple redirect. JimHaroldBooks.com will take you right to the sales page for Campfire 3, and that's the latest book that's available on ebook, on Kindle. And you don't need a Kindle, by the way, to read a Kindle book. There are apps for basically any kind of device out there, phone, tablet, and those are free. But the book is $2.99, and the book is about 250 pages in print, so it's a real book. It's not like a pamphlet. So for $2.99, I think I calculated it out. It's like less than a nickel a story. So we think it's a pretty good deal. And then if you prefer something more tangible, we have the print book, which is $8.99 from Amazon as well in the U.S. So, if you love spooky stories, we think it's a great thing, and particularly this holiday season, we also have Campfire 2, and you could check that out as well. And that's probably actually my favorite of the books is Campfire 2, if I tell the truth.
Really?
Yeah. And the great thing about the books is you can start with any one. There's no order to the books.
Right.
So they're all self-contained.
And your podcast, where can people find you?
Yes, my free podcasts, the Paranormal Podcast, which is audio, the Campfire, which is a lot of what we talked about tonight, and then my video podcast, the Paranormal Report with Micah Hanks. You can find all of those at jimharold.com, on iTunes, on Stitcher. You can find the audio podcasts. Pocket Casts. You can find it on the Roku. I have a Roku channel called Jim Harold's Paranormal TV, where you can hear my audio shows and watch the video show on your big screen TV. Although I don't know if you're going to want to see me on a big screen TV, but you can do it if you're a glutton for punishment. And but really, the place to start is jimharold.com. That'll take you everywhere you need to go, and you can also sign up for a free newsletter up over there too.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, sir.